Hello, everybody. Today we're on Unit 3, Day 8, and we are talking about the Constitutional Convention. We talked about last class the major problems of the Articles of Confederation and some of the issues that it would have and how people came to the realization that, maybe the Articles of Confederation wasn't going to work out. It served its purpose at the time that it was created, but now it was time to advance into something else. Major problems with it. Again, foreign problems. I mentioned this last time that the U.S. government was too weak. The British still maintained military outposts on the frontier here. And again, states didn't follow what we had said with the Treaty of Paris, where the Treaty of Paris said that you had to restore property to loyalists. Also, economic weakness. We talked about how that was a major issue of it. That's a major issue that led into Shays' Rebellion because of the war debts, the inability to tax, and paper money that states were printing. Some states, that paper money was worthless. Also, you had interstate issues. There was no control over interstate commerce. So what you were seeing is some states were taxing others. So for example, let's say you're going to Myrtle Beach and you're a Virginian. You go into North Carolina, they make you pay a North Carolina tax. You go to South Carolina, they make you pay a South Carolina tax. That kind of thing was happening there. And so that would be a big issue. Also, states were having boundary disputes. If you've ever watched the show, how the states got their shapes, they talk a lot about that in the early states, how you're going to see these boundary disputes between states under the Articles of Confederation, and how a lot of the states on the East Coast, how they got their shapes in relation with that. So changing the Articles of Confederation, you're going to see Washington, Morris, Franklin, John Jay, John Adams. They all believe that there's a need for stronger government, and that's why they were called nationalists during the time. And they said Congress needs more control, especially in foreign relation, and the ability to be able to impose tariff. So James Madison would convince the Virginia legislature at that time. He said, let's invite all the states together to discuss tariff and taxation policies. This would be the Annapolis Convention, and you're going to see that only 5 states would actually send delegates to the Annapolis Convention. So at this Annapolis Convention, really the big thing that they did was called for a meeting in Philadelphia to actually look at and review the Articles of Confederations. The Nationalists said, look, we need some changes and there should be some revisions to the Articles of Confederation. So Philadelphia Conventions, 55 states or 55 delegates come from all the states except for Rhode Island during this time. You're going to see that some of the big influential players, such as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, were both abroad as ministers in other nations. Thomas Jefferson was over in France, being a U.S. minister to France. John Adams was in Great Britain, being a minister over there as well. Sam Adams was not chosen to be sent from Massachusetts because a lot of people saw him as more of a radical and because he favored a strictly limited government. Patrick Henry also refused to come from Virginia because he said he smelt a rat. And what he meant by that was he could feel the waves of that there was going to be a stronger federal government be put in place, and he did not like the idea of that. Now, you're going to see that this Philadelphia Convention quickly pivots from changing the Articles to completely replacing the Articles of Confederation. Some of the leaders there, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they both favored an increase in the federal power. And Alexander Hamilton is going to be one of the ones that pushes for the strongest of a central government, even going to the point of kind of almost favoring having a return to a king, which really blew some people's mind. But you will see that they both favored a more powerful federal government, and that's something Alexander Hamilton's going to favor frequently over his time in U.S. politics. So delegates at the convention, you'll see that Washington would be selected as the presiding officer. And the reason that he was selected for that, he didn't really participate in the debates that often, but he was seen as someone as having him in charge of it. And because of his prestige, because of the Revolutionary War, it gave it legitimacy. And that's why they really wanted George Washington to take that role. James Madison, he would be the one that would actually lead a lot of the debate and take notes. And because of that, he is called the father of the Constitution because of the extensive notes that he took and some other things that he did at the convention. That's how he gets that nickname. The convention did meet in secret and plan, again, to replace the Articles of Confederation, despite what their original plans had been, which was just to amend that. And I already mentioned Alexander Hamilton, but you'll see Governor Morris, John Dickinson, all these people that have been involved in the early creation of our country would be at the Constitutional Convention. Normally in class, I would do a Constitutional Convention play. Since we're not meeting as a class, I'm actually just going to post that up for you to read through the play. In some ways, it could probably help you to understand the Constitutional Convention a little bit better. So I will post that up for you to read. So what are some key issues at the Constitutional Convention? One, representation, large states versus small states. If you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, every state only had one representative. And we talked about how the large states didn't like that because they felt like they should have more representation because they were bigger states. They had more population. Smaller states liked the idea of having a single representative because that put them on an equal playing field with the bigger states. So that's going to be a major issue. Next up, slavery. First of all, would there be any regulation of slavery? Like, what is going to happen with slavery, the slave trade, all of that? Like, is there going to be regulation of that? But then the other question is, how do you count slaves when you're starting to count population? When you're determining representation, how do you count slaves towards that? Because they obviously don't have voting rights during this time, and they aren't treated the same as a white man might be treated, or a white family might be treated. So how do you count them towards population? And you're going to see the South. This is going to be very important to them because you're going to have states such as Virginia and South Carolina that have such a high number of slaves. They saw it politically to their advantage to count slaves as part of their population. Next, trade, domestic and foreign. Again, we talked about the issues of states taxing each other. That's going to come up as well as foreign trade and to what level and what power should the government have tariff and taxing power on imported goods. And then next up, the presidency. What is the term of a president going to look like? What is the election of a president going to look like? What's the role of a state in the election of a president? And exactly what are the powers? And again, even beyond this, talking about the presidency, you're actually going to have the same questions about Congress and the judiciary as well when we do officially decide on having this 3-branch government during this time. So, Virginia Plan. Madison, with author, is known as the Virginia Plan. And in this, it states the supremacy of a national authority, including the ability to overturn the state laws. So you're going to see with the Constitution today is known as the supreme law of the land. And a lot of that comes from this Virginia Plan and this idea of there are certain powers that belong to a federal government and a state government, but the federal government always has power over a state government, especially when it comes to federal laws. Establish a government by the people with authority over the people. So the people, again, are willingly giving power to the government and saying you can exercise authority over us. Also, it created a 3-branch government with a 2-house legislature, and the legislature would choose the executive and judicial branches. Now, obviously, you're going to see that last part there is going to change. Actually, in quite a big way, that last part's going to change. But again, having this 3-branch government, obviously, that becomes a hallmark of our system. Now, some issues with the Virginia Plan. One, a federal government that could overturn state laws was unacceptable to states and citizens. Again, remember, people have in mind of what had happened with the British and how the British came in and pretty much dominated the colonies and their legislatures, broke up their legislatures. And a lot of people did not like that whole idea of the federal government being able to come in and overturn state laws. So you're going to see that is going to be changed a little bit. Also, the lower house in the Virginia Plan was going to be picked by the upper house. So it would be like today, the Senate gets to pick who is in the House of Representatives. And the lower house was based on population. So what problems, again, would this cause? I have a chart down here. It's the states are cut off on it, but you can see the population there. And a lot of people were worried about this, especially your smaller states. Like you can see Delaware's at the bottom there, and Virginia is at the top. And little states worried that their rights would be trampled as a state and that they would be constantly overruled by the bigger states. So that is going to lead to the New Jersey Plan, authored by William Paterson. And in that, he wanted to give the Confederation power to raise revenue, control commerce, and make binding requisitions on the states. So again, it's taking the perspective of changing the Articles of Confederation. He also said preserve state control of their own laws. So again, giving that state power to make laws appropriate to them. And this is really something unique in the American system, because this does become part of the American system, where as the United States, we are a collection of 50 states, but you're going to see that even today, each state can govern kind of based on the will of its people. So that's why you look today, you look at California, which is considered more of a liberal state. Their laws fall more in line with that ideology, whereas you look at Texas, which is a more conservative area, you're going to see that their laws fall more in line with that ideology. So that's really kind of cool about the U.S. system, is that based on the area that you live in and what popular sentiment is, that laws can be different based on, the different state that you're in. Also, each state would have one vote in a unicameral legislature. The small states under the New Jersey Plan wanted to keep this idea of only having one house and only having one vote per state. Now, you're going to see after a month of debate, the Virginia Plan would be chosen as the basis of discussion. Two New York representatives at this point leave and say, hey, look, we're supposed to be amending the articles, not creating a new government. So they decide to peace out. I was going to say, though, with even the Virginia Plan being the basis of discussion, that doesn't mean that the New Jersey Plan is completely scrapped. You will see that they do come together and incorporate these two plans together. So that is known as the Great Compromise, or also known as the Connecticut Compromise, where they look at the Virginia and New Jersey Plan and say, hey, how can we meld these together to make sure that the big states and the small states are happy, and that both of them have a voice and a proper proportion of voice in this new government. So representation, again, remains a contentious issue, and the Connecticut delegates are going to suggest that the upper house, which becomes the Senate, would have 2 members from each state, while the lower chamber would be apportioned by population. And you're going to see, while everybody wasn't happy about this, they realized, hey, this is actually a really good compromise and can really balance the interests of the smaller and the larger states. And this is a still hallmark of our system today. If you look, every state today has 2 senators. Doesn't matter the size of it. You look at, let's say, Montana has 2 senators, and California has 2 senators. And then you look at the House of Representatives, and again, that's a portion based on population. So that's why you see places out in the Midwest that have very low population. They only get 1 representative in the House of Representatives, whereas you look at Virginia, we have 11. California has over 50. So again, this was that way of balancing power between the small and the large states. Other issues that they would be able to resolve. 1, judicial power would be given to the Supreme Court, with the establishment of lower federal courts in the states left up to Congress. So Congress would be responsible for creating those lower courts. With that, the power to pick the judicial nominees was left to the president. Now, these nominees have to be, of course, approved by Senate. We're seeing right now, as we're actually going through, or will be going through pretty soon, a Senate confirmation for a new Supreme Court justice. And again, that was a way of balancing power between the 2 branches. It refused the required ownership of land in order to vote. So it gets rid of that for being requirement to vote in federal elections. Again, states could still do that. Federal elections, land ownership would not be required to vote. President would be selected by an electoral college chosen by the states. And again, the electoral college today is something that a lot of people don't like and think is antiquated, and that we need to get rid of that system. I think it's telling, though, that every time that somebody talks about getting rid of the electoral college, that talk doesn't last very long before it is kind of brushed under the rug. And the reason why the Founding Fathers created this electoral college is, 1, to give the states a voice in an election. And it's almost seen as like an extra check on who can be our president. Now, today and throughout history, you're going to see most of the time the electors do vote for who the state votes for. But sometimes you have what is called an unfaithful elector, which will actually vote against the will of the people in that state. But again, the Electoral College is seen as a way of getting the states involved in an election, also being another check. So let's say we elected someone who really, really terrible, Hitler to president, that they could step in and be like, hey, this is not a good idea. So it's almost a check on the passions of the people as well. Also, with the Electoral College, it was meant to as a way to make sure that presidential candidates were involved in all the states and not just the big population centers. And that way, presidents would have to actually, or presidential candidates would have to, campaign in different places, even though campaigning at this point wasn't really a thing, that presidential candidates would have to keep in mind the interests of these small states. And you really do see that bared out today in our election. If you look at a state like California, even though it has the most population, you're going to see candidates generally don't go to California very often because the Democrats have such a strong hold on the elections there. And candidates often go to these places that are much more split, such as in Ohio, a Michigan, a Pennsylvania, Florida, places that aren't the huge population centers, but those electoral votes are very, very important in an election. So they do choose the Electoral College to pick the president. State legislatures would elect senators. This is something that will change later, but at this point, you're going to see state legislatures again would get to pick the senators. The senator was seen as the upper and almost more prestigious house, so they wanted to have more control over who was actually going to be in the Senate. And you're going to see that with this, the Philadelphia Convention is trying to appease the states because they need the states' approval for this to happen. So they're trying to do everything that they can to appease the states so that states would approve it. Again, issue of slavery. Governor Morris of New York would push for strong property rights protections, but he opposed the idea that slaves were property because, again, during this time, slaves were considered a person's property. And again, he's from New York. He wants strong property rights, but he has concerns in calling slaves property. Southern delegates said, hey, look, slavery is very, very important to the Southern economy, and we need to have slavery. But you're going to see that there was actually dispute over the slave trade. And at this point in history, you're going to see it in the South, at least in the American South, that the slave trade really wasn't needed anymore because the slaves that were here were procreating, and you didn't have the large number of death in the slave population like you did somewhere in the Indies or in the Caribbean and those areas where because the conditions were so bad, you were having slaves die at a very high number. So almost in a way, the South didn't need the slave trade anymore. So that's why you're going to see slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade is going to be something that's on the chopping block very, very quickly. George Mason, again, representing planters in the Chesapeake, he called for an end to the trade. And we talked about this earlier in the year, that in the Chesapeake colonies, as far as the conditions for slaves, you're going to see the death rate very, very low compared to other areas. And again, that's why they didn't need the slave trade because they had enough slaves as it was. Rice planters from South Carolina and Georgia, they said imports should continue or they would not be part of the Union. And remember, we talked about South Carolina, where you have most of the slaves worked in rice. And again, with that, you have a lot of mosquitoes, a lot of illness. And that's why they, in a sense, needed and depended on the slave trade. So they're going to push back on this idea of getting rid of the slave trade. Also with this, you're going to see Congress would be denied the power to regulate immigration at this time. Of course, this is going to change later, but Congress would be denied that power. Other slave issues. And again, the compromise that they actually work out on this is that after a period of 20 years, the slave trade would be banned. So that's the balance they worked out to appease the upper and lower southern states there. Other slave issues, some states wanted a fugitive clause that allowed masters to reclaim enslaved blacks who fled to other states. Again, that wouldn't happen until much, much later in U.S. history, but you'll see that that was proposed. Slaves, you're going to see, are not mentioned in the Constitution at all. And in fact, they never use the word slavery in the Constitution. They only use the phrase all other persons in regards to slavery. And I've talked about this before, how we're at a very, kind of weird point in world history at this. You're going to see that within the British Empire very shortly, they would actually outlaw slavery. And it's almost like the United States, we were right on that precipice of, banning slavery and ending the slave trade. But due to interest in this country, we couldn't get over that hump and finally say, hey, let's end the slave trade. Let's get rid of it once and for all. And you're going to see that a lot of the prominent people during this time, such as a Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, these guys owned slaves and hated the idea of slavery at the same time, which, again, we see as incredibly ironic and incredibly hypocritical. But it was almost seen as like this, we're tied into the system without a way out, not to justify it in any way, because, again, these same guys understood that the system was wrong and pushed in some ways to get rid of it. But again, At this point, we still had slave. Again, a lot of that because of the money and interests in the South who said, like, we can't get rid of this system now. So there would be the 3/5 compromise. And basically what this worked out to be was that when counting slaves towards population numbers, again, the South wanted them to count. The North did not want them to count. The areas that had a large number of slaves, they wanted slaves to count as part of the population. So the compromise that they would work out is that slaves would count as 3/5 of the population. So if you had 100 slaves or 10 slaves, 60% of them would count towards the population. Now, famously, this is basically what you're saying is that a slave is only 3/5 of a person. I agree. Sad that happened. Sad that we really boiled down a person to not being a person at all, or only being, 3/5 of a person. But that's the compromise that they worked out for this. I put the number of the slave population at the bottom there, and you see, remember on that other one that I showed you how high Virginia's population was? If you look at Virginia there, Virginia had almost 300,000 slaves. So again, that's why Virginia and other southern states pushed so hard to have slaves count towards the population, because it really would help increase their representation in Congress. So as I mentioned, the agreement, slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and taxation. And it really is a shame in U.S. history at this point that we didn't decide to just ban slavery, or even later on when the British Empire made inroads and decided to ban slavery. It really is a shame that we didn't step to the plate in this. And I think this is one area that our founding fathers really failed at, despite some of them really trying to do that. They failed in this respect of not getting rid of slavery at a time when they could have. But also on the other side of this, you got to remember that this Constitution, they wanted all states to agree on. And if they had just blanket gotten rid of slavery, there's no way that the South would have agreed to this, and we wouldn't have had the Constitution, which eventually did pave the way for getting rid of slavery through the 13th Amendment. As I mentioned before, the Constitution would be known as the supreme law of the land. It would have power of taxation, providing for military defense. Remember, we talked about Shays' Rebellion, how the federal government couldn't do anything about it. Now they would be able to. External commerce with other countries, and the ability to make necessary and proper laws, which is known as the Elastic Clause in the Constitution, which gives the government leeway to make laws in a broad number of ways. Also, the U.S. would honor existing national debt, and states could no longer issue money. So basically, under the Articles of Confederation, we had this debt, and you're going to see that that would be basically transferred to the new government under the Constitution. So what you're going to do now, next class, we're going to talk about the battle to ratify the Constitution and what that looked like. What you're going to do now is actually read and analyze the U.S. Constitution. And it's important to be familiar with and know the Constitution, especially if you ever plan on being involved in politics in some way. It's amazing how many politicians don't really understand the Constitution. So at least reading it and being somewhat familiar with it, I think, is a really good thing for you. So as I said, next class, we're going to jump into the battle over ratification of the Constitution, and make sure that you read the Constitution. Otherwise, I hope you have a fantastic day.